I'm really very, very pleased to be here. I love Dallas. I want to build in Dallas, so let's go. No, seriously, I love Dallas. I think Dallas is a wonderful place. That's where there is lots of great architecture. There's landscape architecture, and there's wonderful art. And those three things together make for a good beginning for nice civilization. When I talk about our work, I always like to talk a little bit about the firm. I started a very long time ago, shall we say, and today we're in office with some 65 people in New York City on Union Square. We have a really terrific office where everybody works with everybody. We're around, I think I just said that, 65 people. And we work in teams, and the teams have their little pods where they come together and exchange. And I realized when we moved into this space that having an office where people can come together is actually really not that different from what we do. We make places where people can come together and communicate and exchange. I always like to show this project because in some ways it's one of the smallest projects I ever worked on. But it's very dear to me because not only was it a project for friends in a wonderful place on the coast of Nova Scotia, on a peninsula to be precise, but it also, in its smallness perhaps, represents many of the values that I think permeate the work we do. So what you see here is a boardwalk in the fog. That boardwalk is probably the most poetic thing in this entire project. And while I would like to take credit for it, I can't. It was actually the builders, the lobster fishermen who built this little cabin that installed the boardwalk to bring materials to the site. This practical gesture in one fell swoop made the entire project. Originally, when we came to the site, my friends, a sculptor and a painter, said to me, well, what do we do here? We can't have electricity and we can't have plumbing, but we'd like to spend a month a year in this location. You couldn't also dig into the ground to install foundations. So the simple idea was to say, we build a platform and we build these little pods on it that accomplished a kind of urban setting, if you will. That urban setting, of course, had to accommodate the dogs. And here you can see the way to the site. The site is only accessible some 3 months of the year, really, and therefore the short season is the summer month. What you see is that there are 3 little buildings, a living space, a bedroom space, and a bathroom space, as it were, and then, of course, over here, a space for the architect to sleep. What was important for me, though, was not just the simplicity of the little cabins, as it were, but it was the proportion of the pedestal, the platform, and the courtyard that this platform and the relationship of the 3 buildings afforded to one another. So you actually had at least twice as many spaces as there were just as interior spaces, because the outside spaces inform the interior spaces. There you see that courtyard, and in some ways the courtyard conceals the most dramatic view out to the sea. But it felt that the view back to the path and the water body where you came from wasn't so terrible either. And so everything really is about being a part of the landscape and experiencing the seasons and finding peace and balance and solitude whilst doing your laundry. And here is that view, and you can just imagine how at any time of the day, any season, well, provided that you can get there in other seasons, but also with any weather, this experience is tremendous. And that project is quite different, of course, from the Neue Galerie, which is a museum for German and Austrian art that we started to work on in 1997. Perhaps some of you have been there. It's a small house museum, but since its opening in 2001, it's become very much a part of the New York museum scene with wonderful exhibitions that celebrate German and Austrian art, with spectacular exhibitions. I think what's very interesting about this museum is that it was a private house at one time, designed by Carrere and Hastings in 1915, and the previous owner had an idea about completely renovating this house, and we were privy to some of the demolition documents that said, "Take grand staircase out." Well, naturally, we decided to leave that staircase in, and we renovated it over the course of some 3 years in such a way that at the end I couldn't remember very well what we had done versus what was old. And that's an interesting thing for a modern architect to do a project that lets you converse, as it were, with the vocabulary of another architect. The work of Carrere and Hastings, who, among other things, did the New York Public Library and the Frick and many other prestigious buildings, was very, very good. But it wasn't perfect. And as we started realizing that, as we started working on the project, we realized there is a constant discourse about how you do a restoration of a project. We uncovered a great skylight that looms over the staircase and that in one fell swoop brought fantastic daylight into the space. We maintained moldings, but we inserted a big glass ceiling into the old music room where fantastic Klimt paintings hang today. What that did was it lent the house the character of a museum. What that did is it created a relationship from 1915 historicizing America to 1915 secessionist Austria. It's actually a very subtle intervention. It looks rather prominent in this photograph. But when you're there, you realize that there is a harmony between these sort of two moments in culture. And it was very important to us to articulate that in some way. The paneling was restored. Again, a new ceiling was inserted so that there's very state-of-the-art lighting. And the third floor, which had been almost completely destroyed by the previous inhabitants, was therefore able to be a much more restrained, much more modern temporary exhibition space. I could go on and on about the Neue Galerie, but I think it's much better if you come to New York and see it yourself, and also enjoy the beautiful bookstore and the fantastic cafe where they have authentic Austrian chocolate cake. And you might like that best. But I briefly wanted to talk about a private residence in Long Island, New York. This is a house that we built in the Hamptons. It's a house for an art dealer. And it's located in a really rather spectacular location, indicated here in red, quite close to the ocean. It's so close to the ocean that you can hear the waves, but you can't see the ocean. And it's an interesting landscape because it's agricultural flat land where there are lots of potato fields. And the Hamptons is the location where there are many fancy private residences and new buildings sprout up like, I don't know what sprouts. Radishes. Now, the house that we built actually replaced a modernist existing house. And I had driven by this site many, many times before and always thought how interesting for me as a European seeing a brick house and a brick modernist house to boot was a pretty fantastic thing. When my client purchased the house, he called me up and he said, "There's a house here and you have to tear it down." I was like, that's the house we have to keep. It took me some time to get my head around it, and eventually I agreed that this house had to go because everything about it, how it was enclosed, was so antithetical to this open, airy landscape. Instead, it was a sort of rather claustrophobic, albeit very modernist volume. But what we retained in the new house was this entrance courtyard. And in fact, to me, this house is more about the sequence of the spaces and how the inside and the outside of the house inform one another. The ground floor is all public spaces that look out on the garden and that are basically in a completely glazed volume. There is a garage that's not visible from the courtyard, and a studio space that looks out on this internal space. As you arrive with a car, you can only really see the screen that you just saw in the picture before. The house is made of all wood, and like I said, the idea is that the ground floor carries a rather more solid upper floor. Light comes in from all sides, and the Long Island light is very special, and lighting, I think, always informs the work we do and really any interesting architecture. You can see here the long enfilade of the spaces on the ground floor. And again, the idea of indoor-outdoor rooms informing one another is something that I'm always fascinated with. It's a very simple house, but it invites everybody to have this indoor-outdoor experience in the summer times, and is rather enclosed in the winter times. Now, by contrast, we have recently started or built a number of apartment buildings. And it's an interesting thing when you build in New York City because the conditions of new construction are so very different. Working for developers is a whole other thing. But for me, the experience of thinking about how people live is actually really very interesting when you come from a place where you've always done design that is very, very specific for a particular person. So when you're designing an apartment building, you start thinking about what is it that is important about living spaces? What does everybody have in common? And how do you create a sort of universal space that is agreeable? And if agreeable sounds like a mild word, I don't really mean it quite like that. I mean it as something that resonates with people. You live in a house for a very long time. For those of us who have rented space, you've made it your home with that which you find, and you accept it. But can we do better than that is really always the question. Now, the other thing, especially in this particular area, is the fact that this building is located in a landmarks district, and there was a lot of negotiation with landmarks about the scale, the size of the windows, the references to other buildings in the neighborhood. And for us, it was important, of course, to say this is a modern building, but creating references to the history of the neighborhood also took on some vitality. And for us, it was actually, in some ways, expressed through color and material. Just a quick view of the very generous open floor plans. That's 2 apartments per floor. The southern view here at the corner is wonderful because it captures all of downtown Manhattan, and the light that the apartments get is very, very beautiful. But really, it's an open, very simple layout. At the end of the day, I think that the most important thing for doing a building like this is to think that architecture lasts for a long time. Artists can go and say, okay, I don't like my work anymore, I'm not showing it anymore, I'll destroy it or something. When you build a building, it's there for the duration. And I take that pretty seriously, and I think about what is it that makes us love cities? What is it, who are the friends that you encounter on your way to work? There are always buildings that somehow resonate with us, and I dare say that's an experience for everybody. For me, there's always a mixture of tactility and rational, and perhaps you can see that as we continue. Especially with this building, we used an age-old material, terracotta, and found new ways of installing it. I'm a little bit interested in that because making something that has been around, something that is familiar, used in a different way and making it accessible is something that creates that kind of friendship, as it were. So there are 3 materials present on the facade: terracotta, which has this sort of shiny, vivacious, curvaceous quality; natural wood for the maisonette part of the building; and corten steel, that essentially is the structural frame. Having the windows set back deep in the facade creates a kind of light and shadow play that you can see from a long distance away, and that creates a very agreeable sort of sense of privacy on the inside of the space. The penthouse is set back, as they often are, and there is a beautiful garden at the top. I wanted to show you a few gallery projects because we have really done quite a few of them. And this is a gallery for a client who I've done a lot of work for, Hauser Wirth, a project that we did in London. This is an existing office building, and they took the ground floor, some 6,000 square feet, and we converted it into large open gallery space. At face value, making spaces for commercial art galleries is not very difficult. Most of the time, they're just 4 white walls and a little bit of light, and you have to try to get the work in and out and call it a day. The more galleries you do and the more you think about it, the more intricate it is. For me, actually, there is something about the simplicity, about the least gesture that we can bring to the exercise that creates a spirit of total balance. I feel that when we work in these galleries, that we work in the service of art. Yet neutral space isn't something that I believe really exist. So I was amused when I encountered a saying that David Hammonds, the artist, created or told me. He said, I went to a tailor in London, and over his door it said, "Good tailor, make few cuts." I quote that all the time. I think that's perfect. That's exactly how I think about things. Like, the less you can do, the better. Now, you could be a little bit more ambitious and quote Einstein here and say, what did he say exactly? Make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And that, too, I think, creates a sort of understanding of what we're after. Simple, simple, simple. It's all about proportion, it's all about light, but it's also all about how people experience the space and how they view the art. And in some ways, I like to think that it's a very rational process to make spaces for art. And in other ways, I know that there is a degree of intuition and understanding of the rhythm in which people walk through space that plays a significant role in it. There are two kinds of spaces at Hauser Wirth. One that has a concrete floor and the other that has a wooden floor and a big glass ceiling, as you can see here. And as you can also see, perhaps, is the atmosphere in those spaces is very, very different. This wasn't coincidental. There was a lot of conversation with the client and with some of the artists about how do artists like to show work. Another gallery, which is an entirely new-built gallery, is for David Zwirner, who is also a dear friend and a client for over 20 years. He called me one day and said, so I bought a building, and I think we're going to tear it down and build a new one. This is what he bought, and at first I thought, well, that's not so bad. Why don't we just see what we can do with it? Well, it was a garage. It had a big, huge ramp in it. The ceilings weren't very high. And relatively quickly, we concluded that, indeed, we had to actually take the building down and build a new building. And then the question is, how do you build a new commercial art gallery? The attributes for this gallery were that they had to serve the gallery's museal artists, estate artists, as they're often referred to. Some big names, Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Richard Serra, Ad Reinhardt. And that was a tall order, building space for those guys. And we thought for a long time, what was this? It's not a museum, it's not just a commercial art gallery. How do you fit a new building in this neighborhood of Chelsea, where there are, as you can see, tall buildings on either side, mid-block condition? And we started to just very rationally define what did we want. David is very, very clear. He's one of the most articulate clients I've ever worked with. And he said, I need a big gallery space that's something like 80 by 80 feet with lots and lots of north-facing daylight. Daylight, of course, is a huge topic, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But what you see in this diagram is a tall building with this kind of big space right in the middle of it. What that meant is, for a site that's relatively square, if you had to build a tall daylit space in the middle of it, you could only build around the perimeter, and that's exactly what we did. So the main gallery really is the heart of the matter. There is that huge square space that has skylights well distributed, a smaller exhibition space and a smaller showroom, common space, staircase, Here's the street, you enter from here. And very simple layout, but very accurate, very functional, very much about how do you bring art into the building, how do people view art, how do you make flexible space so that different kinds of shows can be arranged here. And it looks like it came together just like that, but it didn't, because all of it had to do with how do you introduce systems, structure, functions, etc. To talk a little bit more about daylight, with David Zwirner, we've experimented quite a bit with daylight. It's a position that somebody takes, and when we're here in Dallas in this museum, there are many of the skylights that are covered up. And you have to wonder, why is that? Why do we want to look at art void of daylight? Well, many conservators say art cannot tolerate daylight, but effectively that's not true. It's just that most museal art can only tolerate very little daylight. And there are ways of mitigating light, and in this gallery in particular, there is ample light, but with certain exhibitions, we have to put layers of film on the glazing itself. But what the daylight does, it gives you a sense of grounding. It gives you a sense of orientation. And having these north-facing diagonal skylights create an influx of light that's effectively indirect. Daylight never hits the work of art, and that creates a very airy, very elegant feel for the room. What you see also in this section is, the 5 stories that the building winds around the main space, and there is what it looks like when it is part and parcel of the street. We kept the street wall, but we decided to use a material in the facade, cast-in-place concrete, that you find relatively rarely in New York. The reason why you don't find it very frequently is because the concrete trade is owned by the unions, and the unions haven't invested a great deal in progressing this trade. And so for fear of finding myself in the Hudson River with concrete feet, I had shied away from doing that before. But all kidding aside, it is a fantastic material. And like the terracotta, it's an age-old material. And every architect is somehow or other tempted at some point or another to work with concrete and see if you can do it. I was quite naive when we started this, not realizing how complicated it would be to get 5 or 6 pores on the facade and make the color all look the same. And there was a great deal of mock-ups and learning how to put it together and teaching the contractor and deciding on the width of boards, etc., until we'd finally decided that this is how we would do it. I was unbelievably stressed out because the building was all under scaffolding, so we couldn't really see whether the pores were actually going to match until the day that the scaffolding came off, and phew. But another consideration about the facade was that we didn't just want it to be harsh, hardcore concrete. We wanted there to be a kind of tactility similar to the building on Bond Street that I showed earlier. And we wanted there to be a relationship with nature. There's large windows that bring in plenty of daylights on the upper floors and a very open facade, and they're all wood windows. And the relationship of the hard, maybe a little bit harsh concrete to the teak windows and the teak storefront is something that makes the building very human and actually very inviting. This is a view into the main exhibition spaces on the ground floor. And here is a picture of a Serra installation in the main room, the only time that I have seen this room without any partitions in it. And I very proudly like to tell the story that the day of the opening, or the evening of the opening, Richard Serra had made these pieces for this room. He hit me on the shoulder and he said, "Good space." It doesn't get much better than that. When we designed the building, it was important to us that it wasn't just the facade that was concrete, but that we wanted to express on the inside, too, that it's a concrete structure. With the exception of the large spans in the main exhibition room, indeed, all of the structure is made of concrete. And so we wanted to express that on the inside, and really the only space that's without art is the staircase that winds itself through all 5 floors. And I had always admired that amazing staircase that Le Corbusier designed at La Tourette, and then I thought, I'll show him. Okay, that's really not what I thought, but I admired that staircase all the same, and we negotiated with a structural engineer to make the stringer just as thin as it could be. And if I say so myself, it's a pretty amazing space. It's bathed in daylight. There is absolutely no mitigation of the daylight because it only hits the concrete and the people walking up the stairs. And it's a really wonderful experience because as you land on each level, there are different things to discover. And so there are different exhibition spaces throughout the building. Each and every one of them has slightly different proportions, different height, different width. In this case, the light comes from the south, which is still not very direct because there's another building across the street. As you can see, there's a wood floor on this floor. But there are also a lot of people who work in the building. And so equal attention was given to how people work together and how people work with art and how they come together when there is a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of restaurants or a lot of amenities. And that was fun because in the process we spent a lot of time with everybody who's working in the building, and I think it turned out very nice for them. I'd like to work there. The other thing, of course, that's very unusual is that David's mandate was to produce a LEED Gold building. That's a little bit of an anachronism when you're doing a concrete building because concrete is very energy intensive, but we compensated for that. There's lots of natural ventilation, daylighting, efficient things, bicycle storage, very important, and any number of other features. And in some ways, for us, it was very interesting to see that we now have clients who care about that discourse. And making sustainable architecture is something that also has to be practical, that has to be attainable for everybody. And many of these things are completely commonsensical. And I was very gratified to see that we worked through this together all the way to having a wonderful roof garden designed by Pete Udolf. From there, I want to talk a little bit a project that took a number of years and just finished only 2 years ago, or certain parts of it only as recently as a year ago, the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. I don't know if you've ever heard anything about it, but it's a wonderful museum that was founded by Francine and Sterling Clark in 1955. And they built a building, this one here, oftentimes referred to as the 1955 building. They hired an architect from New York, from Long Island to be precise, Daniel Perry, who I initially always called Daniel Perry, for no particular reason, to build. He was a modern architect, and one with a great deal of integrity until the day that Francine and Sterling asked him to build a temple. And that was wildly confounding for him. And so he designed a museum that is at once a modern space, a temple, and also a house, all at the same time. And it's located in the Berkshires, and as you can see, has really fantastic landscape surrounding it, and housed an absolutely magnificent collection. Over the years, however, there were all these other things that happened. I heard somebody say today that museums break down over a long period of time. Well, that happened a little bit with this museum, but the then director, Michael Conforti, had a grand idea, hired Tadao Ando to do a visitor center, and Reed Hildebrandt from Boston to do the landscape, and Gensler Architects from New York City to sort of be the overall architect of record, executive architect. We were designated to do the renovation of the 1955 building and an adjacent building that's called the 1973 building by Pietro Belluschi. Now, I'm going on and on about this because this intricate makeup is actually very important, because so many aspects of the landscape of the Ando Visitor Center, the location of the Belluschi building to the south of the 55 building, kind of cramped the style of this 1955 building. So what you don't see here is that where this dot is actually a bridge that brings the 1973 building, not shown here, together with the 1955 building. It used to be that you enter here and then ran around the block, and if you were lucky, you'd find the spaces in the middle. Then it got worse, because they then, in 1973, added this bridge, and people started entering sideways, so to speak, and entering in the middle of the race course, and really didn't have much choice but to sort of do this confusing circulation. Why am I talking about this? Because I actually believe that circulation and understanding how people move in space, where they start and stop, and what an agreeable rhythm and what an agreeable proportion of resting to experiencing space is vitally important. And a big aspect to the renovation of this building was to actually reinstate an axial relationship through the building. Tadao Ando did that visitor center, and one more second. This little glass box, abstractly shown here, was a glass box that I wanted to design, but he wouldn't let me. And so we had very little interaction, because early on he said, no, I'm doing the glass box, and you do yours, and I do mine. That's as much as we collaborated. On the upside was I didn't have to learn Japanese. But the project was plenty complicated on its own, because it really was about learning to know what this collection did, how you wanted to explore the museum, how you wanted to learn to understand it, bring decorative arts into the mix, and start thinking about how to make a renovation in a building that was practically a gut renovation, and yet at the end have people have the impression that nothing ever happened. In this room, for example, we restored and renovated the ceiling, but that was actually there. In all honesty, I think that the proportions of this room aren't very, very good. But what I learned yet again is that when you pay attention to absolutely every detail, you can actually sort of mold space in ways that go beyond just changing the size of a room. So we worked a lot with color, we changed systems, we changed lighting, we again brought daylight back into the building, so from time to time you have these wonderful views of the Berkshires. And they made looking at some of these old master paintings that are absolutely exquisite, truly wonderful. In this picture it looks as if daylight is just streaming in unmitigated, but in actual fact there is UV filters and shades and so on and so forth. We designed cases for the decorative art collection, and again, I think that when you're working with art, you have to have sympathy for the people who are going to experience it. And so you need to learn about the art, but you also need to have the naivete of, and the curiosity that lets you anticipate how people will experience the view and the space. It was a nice moment for us to also do the first installation of an exhibition of Chinese bronzes in Tadeo Ando's visitor center. And as you can see here, it's very, very open to the view. And so we installed these scrims to create a kind of private space in which, again, focus and concentration on the art was as much possible as there was sort of fluidity with the overall architecture. Going on and on and on here, I'll try to speed up a little bit. This is a project in France, and it's called the Luma Foundation in ARLES. That's in the south of France. And Luma is located in an old SNCF, that's the French railway factory. It's an interesting situation in as much as Arles is very much a Roman town that has a Colosseum and an amphitheater. And some 10 years ago, a patron by the name of Maya Hoffman decided that after the facility closed and there were a lot of people who were sort of displaced, so to speak, bringing art into this into the industrial ruins of this site would be a very good idea to enliven the city and bringing back a kind of different spirit after industrialism had failed the people of Arles. Interestingly, she decided to hire Frank Gehry to make a kind of symbolic building. And Frank has worked on this thing here. No, I didn't mean, sorry. But what would you call it? I'm not supposed to call it a tower. So let's call it a thing. And it is a thing. It's a big thing. It moved around the site quite a bit long before I ever had anything to do with this. It was originally sitting right here in the middle of the area, which is some 15 acres large. And this entire area here is about 7 meters or 20 feet lower than street level, than city level across here. Now, Frank's building is truly, in some ways, very symbolic. There is no one specific function in it, even though it has a variety of things. It has a library in it, it has a cafe in it, it has lots of things that will bring people together and that are very, very important. But it wasn't dedicated to one function, because the one function of showing experimental contemporary art or contemporary arts is actually happening in the remnants of the industrial buildings right here. And I was lucky to be allowed to work on these. I'm going to just skip right to the next picture because it describes a little bit what we found. There are these literally ruins of 19th century factory buildings that have a kind of neoclassical quality about them. But many of them were sort of hollowed out and empty. So we built spaces up again. Here, this picture shows an open courtyard that is within the ruins of the building, and straight ahead you can see that there is a two-story space beyond, which is dedicated to exhibitions, to photography exhibitions most of the time. Here is a building that's called the Mécanique, and we've added this little bay to it. Now you might wonder, why add something when you already have so much space? But it was important to us to have column-free space in this area here and create different kinds of exhibitions where sculpture could take place, where performance could take place. And in some ways, I like this picture very much because it shows you a kind of industrial context. It shows you how new meets old and how there is a fluidity between the spaces that's really remarkable. And in fact, I think making these kinds of transformations from one function to another are so interesting because they're always about how we can engage people in different activities. We're working with the landscape architect Bas Smeets from Brussels, and in the next couple of years, all of which looks like a sort of rather barren landscape, is actually going to be transformed into a wonderful park. And here you see some of those spaces on the inside, completely empty, then with exhibitions in them, and super interesting because the structure is so prominent and so clear, but within that space you can you have a great deal of flexibility to do different things. Again, the topic of daylight is something that I think is always very, very important. And when I look at the building here, I think this transformation is really brought to life by the people in it and the people who use it. So looking at performance and dance rehearsal in part of this building was really marvelous for me because we had worked for such a long time on trying to control the daylight and understanding where the openings were and how the floor and so on and so forth. And then 4 weeks later, after we were ostensibly done, there were all these young people rehearsing dance performances, and I could have sat there all day because it just seemed like such an incredible transformation. This is a project that is very much in the early stages. It's the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, in La Jolla. And what you see here is a photo from, I think, 1945 or something like that, of the original Irving Gill building. He was an architect in California, as you know, no doubt, who worked in the late teens and 20s, whose motto was simplicity, sincerity, serenity. I have always loved that because with these three simple words, he indeed transformed in all of La Jolla in a very elegant, very human way. And his style and his sense of clarity and proportion still resonates in La Jolla. Later, over the years, two architects transformed the building. Originally, this building was a private residence for Ellen Scripps, who, after she died, left the building to the Art Center of La Jolla. And they started to add to the building, hiring a company called Mosier and Drew, and later in 1997, Bob Venturi. And Bob Venturi undid something that Mosier and Drew had done. He removed sort of a very large colonnade that traveled along here and ostensibly brought the facade back to the street. But then he very quickly decided that he would put some columns of his own in there that had a very different quality, as all of his architecture did, naturally, and added also a space that you can see here to the right, which is called the Axline Court. When the museum came to us, they were in dire need for gallery space because despite the fact that they had added this space in 1997, they had actually not gained a great deal of gallery space, and they realized that they could show very little of their rather magnificent collection of mostly modern art, modern contemporary art, and a lot of wonderful Southern California art. And so they invited us to compete against some other colleagues, and luckily we won. And so this project is in the making, and what you see here is a proposal that we've been working on for some time. We're proposing to convert what used to be an auditorium, slightly larger than this space, into gallery space, reorganizing a new entry. We're removing these columns here, so to really see the Irving Gill building, but being very careful to making sure that we keep every phase of the architecture that the building has experienced somewhat intact or somewhat legible, because I think it is very important that buildings that change over time have a kind of legible footprint that pays heed to the work that was done. To the south of the existing auditorium, sort of going down the hill, is along Bar Building, and there's more gallery space there. So ultimately, we're adding new entrance, new bookstore, and some 30,000 square feet of gallery space. It's a small site, and it's a difficult site. It's a difficult site because when you're there, you realize that you have to make the ocean your friend, because you can't compete with it. You can see even in this picture that the view is overwhelming, and you can never escape it. So how do you deal with that? We decided that a promenade through the museum would have to afford you both. It would have to afford you sort of quiet, focused space where you can look at art, but at times also interaction with this incredible view and this incredible natural landscape and the fantastic Southern California light. So you see in this model picture here that we're introducing, again, some skylights in the very tall ceiling of the old auditorium so that we have modulated light in the gallery space, and then these sort of bar-shaped spaces that cascade down the hill down to Coast Road. It's an interesting situation because so many different architecture styles hit one another. And again, my philosophy is to sort of do as little as possible, but let the space, the proportions, and the light really be in the foreground and create exceptional art space and a sort of calm and supportive space. Materials are going to be travertine and stucco so that we can organize the multitude of volumes that is along Coast Road. And again, that's also an interesting thing because when you look around the buildings in La Jolla. One of the most incredible pieces of architecture, of course, is Salk Institute. And it's a humbling experience to encounter the intelligence of Salk. It is simply worth a trip if you haven't been there. But for me, it was a really great lesson because I think, again, doing less and inviting the intelligence of everybody else to come together to that grand purpose of bringing people together and allowing the art to speak for itself is really what's at the center of everything. Quickly here in colored block diagrams, the blue represents the gallery space, yellow is circulation, and you can quickly see that we're adding quite a bit of gallery space. On the lower floor along Coast Road is more gallery space. And even looking at this plan, I think that you can quickly realize that the geometry on this site is very, very complicated. So finding a way to unfold it, as it were, and making it something that is really all about the rhythm again, an understanding of proportions of space and understanding lights and views is ultimately what we're after. Here are some early renderings of the spaces. If you know how to do an art space, you also know how to do a recycling facility. Or so I thought. Yeah, it was a very unlikely situation for us to be chosen in a small competition to do a recycling facility. And I remember exactly that when the RFP came around, how incredibly excited I was and everybody in the office was about possibly doing a recycling facility. We knew very little about recycling and certainly knew very little about municipal recycling other than that we thought it was a good thing. And it is a good thing, but it's also a messy thing. SIMS Municipal Recycling is a public-private partnership. SIMS is a large company that partnered with the sanitation department and the EDC, the Economical Development Corporation of New York City. And New York City offered an 11-acre pier in Sunset Park on the working waterfront of Brooklyn. And here you see that pier just after it was cleaned up. It was previously used for evidence vehicles, and the first time I looked at the site, there were all these cars with bullet holes in them. I wanted to spare you that view. But it's kind of interesting to see this picture just because you realize how magnificent the views are looking at Manhattan to the sort of northeast there, and realizing that 11 acres is a pretty big plot of land. We learned very quickly that we had to locate the facility on the south of the pier. And in fact, I should say that we weren't hired so much to do the architecture, which we did end up doing, but in the first place, we were invited to choose materials. Well, that's not enough for most architects. And so we mingled with the engineers right away who said, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. But we pushed our way through there and helped master plan the entire site. And that was truly the interesting part because there are some big buildings here, as you can see, and the one highlighted here is called a tipping building. That's where the trucks come and unload the recyclables. Then from there, they're sent to the processing building where the processing takes place. From there, they go to the bale building where compressed bales are being picked up again. Now, all of that is fairly messy, and the administration and education center therefore has to stay out of the way. So a big task to begin with was actually how to organize the site, because there are many different traffic streams. There are pedestrians who walk along the north edge to the administration building. There is car traffic of people who work at the facility, or buses that drop children off to go into the education center. But then there are also screaming trucks that come in here that get weighed and then unload in here. Or there are rail cars that enter and unload over here, and there are barges that load and unload over here. And keeping everybody safe is actually a really important part of all of this. So it was kind of an interesting thing to study different diagrams and then overlay architectural considerations about having sort of open courtyard-like situations over here, creating vistas through there. It's not so much really about vistas, but about creating, again, inside and outside spaces for trucks to arrive and different volumes juxtaposed to one another. What's also interesting, or was interesting for us, is that we wanted to install a large solar field, and so the roof was sloped in a southern direction and overhangs the water by the dimension of a barge that can unload there without getting into the wind. The vocabulary, the architectural vocabulary, of course, had to be cost-effective, but also be something that could sustain very large spans. So we worked with a company on a pre-engineered building, something that you would have seen in a big box building. But we talked with everybody and said, what we want to do is we want to turn the structure outside so as to express the very nature of the structure and the very nature of the building. That cost a little bit of extra money, and truly just a little bit, because contending with a minimum budget was always very important. Here is a view of the tipping building and the dramatic open space that truly can only be accomplished by this kind of pre-engineered building technology. And here is what I did on the weekends, is I tried to figure out how to send recyclables from A to B. Now, this is an unbelievably interesting and complex technology that has magnets and sort of mechanisms that sort the material out while keeping people safe, and is very very highly automated, and every day becomes more automated. The other thing was, of course, to say that the tipping building, the processing building, was one kind of scale, and the education and administration building was another kind of scale. It was important for us, if we were doing an education aspect to the facility, that people could actually see recyclables in action, so to speak. And so we designed this bridge that had to be 30 feet up in the air so that trucks could pass underneath. And it all of a sudden became an architectural composition that lent us a little bit of interest. And indeed, so there was an opportunity to use one and the same material to clad absolutely everything, this silvery corrugated material that's called Fibrel. And with very simple moves, again, juxtaposing different volumes to one another, expressing a kind of linear quality in the administration building with a vertical element of the bridge tower, to create something that was a little bit compositional, but calm and welcoming. And welcoming indeed it is for a lot of school children. I'm always thrilled when people tell me, it's like, oh, we were in your recycling facility. My kids love it. And it is great because there is so much to learn, and I encourage everybody to come and see this and actually spend the time to learn about the materials and how we can process them. Here are the children on the bridge, and there they are, looking at material in action. A project that is very, very dear to me and to everybody in my office is a project that we're doing pro bono with the Plus 14 Foundation. A friend of mine, Joe Mizzi, a wonderful man who is the head of the Plus 14 Foundation and a friend, one day called me up and he said, would you help me with a school in Mabwindo, Zambia? And of course, I was very much game. But when I asked the people in my office who would volunteer to work on this project, I was very touched to realize that of 65 people, 58 of them wanted to participate. It's a beautiful place, but it's a very poor place, and education is scarce, and the ways for children to get to school are very long. And that is what my friend Joe discovered, is that there are just not enough schools. The first school he built with another architect, Susie Rodriguez from Enyad. It's not very far away, and it's called Chipakata. And we learned a little bit from their first experience about what to do and what not to do. But Joe encouraged us to sort of come up with our own ideas. And what we focused on was to say there's really 3 components, or 4 components, as it were. There is the school with sort of administration stuff. Then there's a big soccer game. That's actually the most important thing. There's a community garden, and then there's teachers' housing. Together, all of these elements are really creating community. They encourage people to move closer to the center, to make sure that their children really do go to school, to make sure that people are taken care of. There's cooking for the families that takes place over here. And to create a very simple roofed tent, so to speak, where people can find shades, and where there are classroom buildings, and there are buildings for there are spaces for congregation, and for art, for reading, for all of that. And here are some renderings of it, and it's an interesting thing when you think about reducing the elements so much so that you can use local materials, so that local people can actually build the school. Everything comes from very nearby and is very easily built by the people who live there, and very quickly becomes something that envelopes the entire community. So we started to make these drawings. We're also working with the artist Rashid Johnson, who is going to do a big mural here. And we found that everybody's enthusiasm was so great that they didn't want to wait. And now they're building it. And it looks just like we drew it. And people are actually building it themselves. So David Bench from my office went there the other day and helped everybody figure out how to use the brick-making machine. And it's so much fun to see this kind of action and to see the enthusiasm of everybody and having the kids come around and play. I simply cannot wait to go. For me, this is something that's immensely fulfilling, because it's why I went to architecture school, and it's why I am an architect, is to do simple things that make a difference. And we tried to make them beautiful while we're at it. And it's damn beautiful, isn't it? And when we're not making bricks, we think about the frick, which is also a very worthwhile cause. I don't know what you know about the Frick, but it's a wonderful, large house museum that was built by Henry Clay Frick. He started it with Carrere and Hastings in the 19-teens. I think it began in 1913 and was completed in 1917. And after his death, really in the 1930s, John Russell Pope added and changed the house in such a way that it could become a public museum. It's a museum that's revered for its architecture, for its character, and naturally also for its art. It's always been my favorite museum in New York, and having the commission to renovate, restore, and perhaps expand it a little bit is a project of a lifetime. I'm thrilled. We're going to take all of this down, put big skylights in. Just you wait. And that's it for tonight. Thank you very much.